racism, or I had folks give me this one that I really found interesting. Well, I don't really do race in my work. And I found that to be interesting. I said, well, if you do education work, then guess what? Whether you recognize it or not, you're doing race work because education in this country, at least, has always been about sort of racial litmus tests, right? I mean, we just recognized the 70-year anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. Some would argue that is the most significant ruling that's ever been handed down by the Supreme Court in this nation's history. And it had to do with what? Schools. Because we
Right.
thought that if we could become this sort of beacon of democracy, freedom, and opportunity with education, it could happen in other spaces as well. So I just didn't buy the whole idea that people tried to sell to me that they don't do work, they don't do race in their work. And the fact that you don't, that's the wake-up call. You maybe should start asking some different questions.
Welcome to EDUP Xcelerated Excellence, a podcast for the advancement of educational effectiveness and equity across both traditional and non-traditional learning environments and experiences. I am your host for this episode, Jacob Easley II, PhD, PMP. Let's get into it.
Leaders, entrepreneurs, and change agents looking for the opportunity to network and exchange ideas with other trailblazers and to further your brand. The 2.0 conference is for you. Experts from the fields of education, health, internet, marketing, and CXO are welcome to take part in the 2025 conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, March 4th through 6th. Reserve your space today and receive a 10% discount courtesy of EDUP Xcelerated Excellence with the code EDUP10OFF. That's EDUP10OFF. Learn more and register online at www.the2conf.com. That's the2conf.com with the code EDUP10OFF.
This episode of EDUP Xcelerated Excellence is supported in part by Eastern Connecticut State University. The path to your future begins at Eastern Connecticut State University. Explore a campus buzzing with creativity, innovation, and opportunity. From arts to sciences, we have programs that spark your curiosity and ignite your passion. Don't miss your chance to discover what makes Eastern unique. Visit us online to create your customized viewbook at easternct.edu/journey. That's easternct.edu/journey. Welcome back to EDUP Xcelerated Excellence, a podcast for the advancement of educational equity and effectiveness. Today's guest is an internationally recognized scholar, an educational advocate, a facilitator of change, educator, and educational leader. He is the Pritzker Family Endowed Chair in the School of Education and Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA. He is the author of more than 100 scholarly articles, policy briefs, and technical reports. He has also published 6 books, the latest of which is Equity Now, Justice, Repair, and Belonging in Schools, published by Corwin Press. Welcome to the show, Dr. Howard.
Thank you, Jacob, for having me. I'm honored to be here.
So thank you for joining us today. And for the audience, I think it's important for them to know that you're the immediate past president of the American Educational Research Association, or AERA. So how rewarding was that experience?
Yeah, it was certainly one of my professional highlights. You know, AERA was really instrumental in my own scholarly development. I attended for the first time in 1995 in New York City. I was overwhelmed, a lot of people, but I learned a lot. And never in my wildest dreams would you have told me then that one day I would be president of the association. But yeah, it was a riveting experience. I got a chance to meet a lot of people, had a chance to learn about a lot of different types of research being done by folks in this 25,000 member association. Got a chance to really engage in the city of Philadelphia, which is where we had our annual meeting, and really got to understand some of the ins and outs behind the curtain, as I say, with an organization as complex and as large as AERA. So A lot of good work being done by a lot of really smart people. My goal was to have us have this larger conversation about racial inequality in education. And I think
Mhm.
to a large degree we were successful. So I would say it was a rousing success, not just by my own account, by what I've heard from many people since the meeting occurred last month.
I have to echo that. I think folks is the there's a reverberation and it continues. So,
Yes, I hope so.
we have a few questions from the field that we'll get to later in the program that specifically address your presidency during at your time of presidency or the president of AERA. So, as you mentioned, the conference did center racial equity. You also stressed the importance for conference goers to consider global racial equity. So, can you share your perspective on why global issues are important or are needed?
Yeah, I think what happens sometimes here in the States is that we get very we have a tunnel vision about how we think about the issues that we face here. And we don't recognize that some of these same challenges are happening in other parts of the world. And unfortunately, racism is one of them. But racism looks different in South America. Racism looks different in Central America. Racism manifests itself in a different way in places like, Brazil or even, parts of of Europe and parts of, places like Australia. So I wanted folks, because we have a large and growing part of our association that are international scholars. And I didn't
Mhm.
want folks to think that this was only a US centric issue, but I'm convinced that racism happens the world over and that we had to have a much broader lens to begin to interrogate, investigate, and try to better understand how we are combating racial inequality. How can we better talk about it? I don't think we can address it until we at least acknowledge that it's there. Once you acknowledge that it's there, then you begin to talk about it, then you move towards some collective action to begin to dismantle it. So I wanted this global conversation. I was pleased to hear scholars from all over the world who were raising these conversations, folks who came from parts of Africa, folks who were there from European countries, Canada, Mexico. So yeah, we've got to have this global conversation, but knowing that it's going to have a very different way of how it plays out from country to country.
Right. I think you're spot on in terms of thinking about inequities and injustices that play out in society. And in this case, AERA, so in educational spaces.
Yes.
It's interesting when I talk to colleagues from Africa, and this is primarily West Africa, so not necessarily South Africa.
Right.
Uh, Individuals will talk first and foremost around tribal or
Yep.
intergroup distinctions and economic challenges versus racial issues, because in that regard, almost all of the community members are of the same racial background. However,
Yes.
they share
Yes.
different cultural norms and political perspectives and economic traditions and histories.
Yeah, that's the same thing I found, Jacob. Having spent time in South Africa, there is more of a racial hierarchy because of the presence of non-black folks in South Africa. But in my
Mhm.
travels in Ghana, for example, yeah, 99% of folks there are black. So the differences are sort of centered around, like you said, tribal affiliation, socioeconomic status, educational status. So yeah, so it looks different in each context, but I think the larger goal is how do we sort of address inequality?
Yeah, and I think that's important. So I like the fact that it was centered on well, racial equality and quality in general. So
Yeah.
how does one get to become the president of an organization
Ooh.
like AERA?
Yeah, I wish I could lay out this blueprint to say this was something I was always planning to do, wanted to do, but it's not the case. I just was fortunate that over the years, I just got involved. I mean, I've learned in this profession that if you see a problem and you speak out against the problem, folks will say, well, hey, are you willing to volunteer to be part of the solution for that problem? And that's
Right.
what I did. I don't know when to shut my mouth sometimes. So early on, I would, complain about X, Y, and Z, and they put me on committee after committee. And next thing I know, I looked up like 10 years into my time at AERA, and I served on probably several different committees, been in a number of different divisions, was active in a number of different special interest groups. So I just kind of got more and more involved. And then I think when it really started to accelerate, and this is what I encourage people to think about, I was nominated to run for AERA Council in
Hmm.
2015, I think it was. And AERA Council is really the decision-making body for the organization. And I fought it. I fought it. I felt like I didn't have the time, didn't have the commitment, but decided to do it thinking, okay, nobody's going to vote for me anyway. lo and behold, I get elected. And that was when I really got to understand more of the ins and outs of the association. So I served as 3 years as a member at large representative for the association. And those 3 years from 2016 to 19 really gave me a sense of what AERA was about. And I think at that point, people who have been AERA president usually have some extensive amount of work in AERA leadership. So when I was asked once again to run for president, I fought it. Didn't want to do it. Not the right time. I said, okay, finally had my arm twisted into doing it, but I thought nobody would vote for me because, and lo and behold, how that turns out. So yeah, so it just kind of organically evolved, and I wish I could say I planned it out from the time I started in being involved in 1996, but that was not the case. It just kind of kept growing and kept going and kept expanding opportunity.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of our first guests on the show was Dr. Elsa Nunez, and she talked about she's retired from her presidency at Eastern Connecticut State University, but she talked about having served as a provost, multiple appointments as provost. So the idea is that she went through the process very slowly to eventually become president of the university. So that's very interesting that, there's this, I guess, idea of paying one's dues. But
Yes.
really what you're saying is that time allowed you to, as you said, look behind the curtain and
Yes.
actually understand how the organization works.
Yeah.
One last question about your presidency at ARA. So how influential were you in determining the theme for the conference?
Yeah, that's one of the big perks of the presidency of ARA. You get to determine what your theme will look like for that year. And so I would say that next to the number of probably 4 dozen committee appointments that you make, that your
Hmm.
theme is arguably the most important thing that you do as president, because you get to set the tone about what we're going to talk about for that given year. And so not that you had to talk about the issues around racial inequality, but preference and priority was given to those sessions that did address it. And I just had a lot of folks while we were at the conference, even before the conference, who just said thank you for giving license. So thank you for naming something that has always been a part of my work, but I felt like my work was so marginalized. Thank you for saying, yes, we're going to have an association-wide discussion around racial inequality. But I also wanted folks to look at it within the context of an intersectional framework. So I didn't want to just look at race writ large, but what does racism look like for women? What does it look like for folks who are international folks? What does it look like for folks who are queer? So how do we look at different intersections if you're immigrant and a person of color? So I just had lots of emails. And I keep saying I want to go back through them and save them and collect them. Just a number of emails and text messages that folks sent me just saying, thank you. This conference felt so affirming. I felt like I was at home. I didn't have to explain why racism is important. I didn't have to try to, sort of subsume race under other categories. And so that was really helpful for me. But I have to say, Jacob, when I first announced the theme, I shouldn't have been surprised, but there were folks who were really critical of it behind the scenes. They came up to me and said, well, do you really want to talk about race? Doesn't talking about race lead to more racism? Or I had folks give me this one that I really found interesting. Well, I don't really do race in my work. And I found that to be interesting. I said, well, if you do education work, then guess what? Whether you recognize it or not, you're doing race work, because education in this country, at least, has always been about sort of racial litmus tests, right? I mean, we just recognized the 70-year anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. Some would argue that is the most significant ruling that's ever been handed down by the Supreme Court in this nation's history. And it had to do with what? Schools. Because we thought that if we could become this sort of beacon of democracy, freedom, and opportunity with education, it could happen in other spaces as well. So I just didn't buy the whole idea that people tried to sell to me, that they don't do work, they don't do race in their work. And the fact that you don't, that's the wake-up call. You maybe should start asking some different questions.
So I want to thank you for the theme. I think it has definitely, as I said earlier, had an impact, and the impact has been reverberating even since the conference.
Thank you.
So let's talk a bit about your book. So your very new book, Equity Now. So in your book, you speak about your father's words, and I'm going to paraphrase, but his words were to take education seriously, to get as much as you can, because once you have it, no one can take it from you. So how did your upbringing influence your perspectives or views on educational equity?
Oh, very much so. I tell my students all the time that research is me search. And they tell you that, okay, doc, we get tired of you saying that. I think so much of what we do in our research is tied to our own lived experiences. And so for me, a lot of what I do is tied to my upbringing and I talk about it in the book. My dad always stressed education. Get as much of it as you can, to your point, Jacob, because it's something that can never be taken from you. My dad is a product of the segregated South, grew up in the 40s and 50s, where education opportunities were not always afforded to Black folks. So I think
Right.
he is of that generation who says, for years we fought for opportunity. How dare you not do everything in this context to get as much of it as you can? And so education was really stressed. But the other thing I mentioned is the fact that I talk about in the book that one of the things I say that equity should be about is how do we do the work we do, thinking about all students, of course, but
Right.
how do we think about those who are the least amongst us, the most more marginalized, the most excluded? And again, that comes back to my upbringing with my dad. My dad always was someone who stressed. We go visit his hometown, Louisiana, and we would go see, Miss Louise, who lived down the street. He said, we got to go see her because Miss Louise has nobody to look in for her. She
Hmm.
has no kids, she has no family, so we're going to go and look out for her. I remember growing up in Compton, Miss Brown lived down the street, and my dad would say, we're going to go cut Miss Brown's grass and take out her trash because she lives alone and she's disabled. My dad always stressed to do whatever you could to be able to advocate and support those who are the least amongst us. So when I talk about equity in this book, when folks say, well, shouldn't we just give everybody the same thing? And I try to make this distinction between equity and equality. You know about this, Jacob,
Right,
is that
right, right.
equality says give everybody the same thing. And I say we have to meet people where they are, but have an intentional and bold and unapologetic focus on those who have historically been marginalized, those who have historically been without, those who have historically been silenced and looked over and underserved. And so that's why I try to frame this around what I remember my dad always saying, that you need to be mindful of those who are the least amongst us, because one day that could be you.
Well, that's a great homage to him, but I'm sure your family appreciates that work, and those are sort of the life values that I think are
Yes,
important. I really appreciate this, and you don't mind if I use it in some other context, but
please
research
do.
is me search.
That's right. That's right.
And I think that's important because I think the way folks enter into their research agendas is largely based on personal experiences and up close and personal sort of contexts that shape how you view and you see the world.
That's right.
So I think when we have folks that come together from completely different worldviews, that in itself may have been some of the struggle with why folks say, why are you centering race? Whereas
That's
when
right.
you walk in the room as a person of color, you have, particularly if you've embodied
Right.
your racial
Right.
identity,
Right.
um, you don't leave it at the door when you walk
That's right.
in. So
That's
for
right.
folks who don't have that same experience, it does become a struggle for them to understand why this is so important to certain folks.
Yeah. No, I think that's well said. And I always tell students that, listen, if you're going to embark upon a career in education research, you're going to spend a lot of hours reading, studying, writing. You need to feel deeply passionate about what you're doing this work about. And
Hmm.
I always tell folks that I think the things that we oftentimes feel most passionate about are the things we've experienced, the things we've
That's right.
encountered, things we've seen. So I always tell folks, tell your story, because everybody has a story. Now, I'm not knocking those folks who choose to do their work around things that are not tied to their realities. But if you do a deeper dive and you ask most folks why they do the kind of work that they do, somewhere in that response is going to be, well, because I once experienced it, or someone in my family once experienced it, or I saw it, or I know about this. And so that's why I push back on these notions of objectivity, which we know is a fallacy. All research is subjective, from the questions we ask to the research that we do. And I just want folks to just name it and do it to the best of their ability.
Yeah, it's important because you think about, I want to ask you probe a bit later around the teacher pipeline, but we
Yes.
know that many folks who go or pursue professions in teaching, or let's just say in education in general, is because they've had some affinity to education at some point in their life. Either
Yes.
someone in their family has been a teacher, or someone who has influenced them
Yes.
significantly has been a
Yes.
teacher. And
Yes.
it's this association with the profession through personal experiences that often brings people into the profession. So I can see how that works for research as well.
Absolutely.
So in your book, you address equity and belonging, and I believe you do so very comprehensively to
Thank you.
include, yeah, I mean, absolutely. So to include both conditions for schools and districts, and then of course for leaders. But you also pay attention to the roles of parents and caregivers, which I absolutely appreciate. I that chapter, I think I was sitting up, but I think I sat up a little straighter because I really wanted to understand, to hear what you were going to say, and how those individuals, caregivers and parents, play a role in educational equity. Can you explain your thoughts on why we should rethink their engagement?
Yeah. So I always say that parents and caregivers are the sleeping giant in educational reform, educational equity. I think that, well, I don't think, I know that the data has told us for a long time that the more concerned, caring adults are involved in young people's education, the better their experiences and their outcomes are. So when I use the term parents and caregivers, I'm mindful of the fact that we have over 2.5 million young people who are being raised by grandparents. Then there's another 5 million young people who are being raised by extended family members, sisters, brothers, aunts, uncles. So part of what I don't want to do is narrow this to say only parents, because there are folks who are non-parents who are also involved in this work. But part of we have to ask the question is, why do these folks not engage in schools? And I think this is where we as school leaders have to be willing to hear some hard truths. And those hard truths are anchored in the fact that for many of our parents and caregivers, they don't want to see or be around schools because they see schools as the scene of the crime. These were places that
Mm,
were hostile toward me. They were places that make me feel less than. There were places that I didn't feel welcome. There were places that nobody believed me. There were places that I didn't feel like I could be my authentic self. And the list goes on. So for a lot
right.
of adults, they have very negative sort of views and beliefs and perceptions about what school is. And some will go so far as to tell their kids. It's not a matter of if the school will do wrong by you. It's only a matter of when they will do wrong by you. So you've got this real contentious relationship that exists for many, not all, for many parents and caregivers. So that's why they don't engage, right? Not all, some. But then for those who do want to engage, schools want to control when you show up, what you do, and when you leave. Okay, come on PTO, PTA nights, come on back to school night, come on open house, and then be out of here by a certain time. And I'm saying,
Mhm.
you got folks who are highly educated, who have lots of skills. Why don't we ask them to serve on some of these budget committees and personnel committees and search committees? Let's not reduce people to these very superficial kinds of roles and titles in terms of how they participate in school. Ask parents to come and volunteer in classrooms, because another adult in a classroom can help to reduce the adult to student ratio, right? I think we have to be willing to listen. We should be doing parent caregiver surveys annually. What do parents want more of? What do they want less of, right? I think that we have to begin to sit in the uncomfortable position of asking our most angry, our most disenfranchised, our most excluded parents why they don't see a role for themselves at schools. And we may not like what we hear, but my mother always said the truth sometimes hurts. And if we're really truly concerned about this, I think we have to sit in it, we have to listen to it, and we have to learn from it to do something different and something better. I think a lot of parents want to advocate for their young people, they just don't know how to. And so
Mm,
I think one of the things we have to help parents and caregivers understand that there's a shift. Years ago, my mother and father said, my goal is just to get you to school. And once I got you to school, the school did all the rest. And some parents still have that same belief today. My job is just to get my child to school and the school does the rest. We are better when we're in partnership, right? So parents need to understand, caregivers need to understand, look, you got to work as in tandem with your school, right? There are some activities, there are some strategies that you can do at home that fortify your child's learning. There are some things I need you to pick up on when you're at home that can help that student struggle with the concept. So we have to begin to demonstrate for parents and caregivers ways that they can amplify their students' learning so that when they come to school, they have a better chance for success. Teachers will say all the time, listen, I got 30, 35 kids on any given day. So the ratio of adults to young people is 35-1. You may have 3 kids at home. You got a 3-1 ratio. Your ratio is much better than mine to have some impact. So it's just talking about those kinds of things. But I also recognize that parents have some hard, complex lives. A lot of parents can't show up because they work like my parents did. Sometimes they work multiple jobs. Sometimes they didn't see their parents show up, so they feel like I shouldn't show up. So I just think we need to do a better job of listening and inviting and really hearing what parents want. And then I think we can begin to do something different.
Experts from the fields of education, health, internet, marketing, and CXO are welcome to take part in the 2025 2.0 conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, March 4th through 6. Reserve your space today and receive a 10% discount courtesy of EDUP Xcelerated Excellence with the code EDUP10OFF. That's EDUP10 off. Learn more and register online at www.the2conf.com. That's the2conf.com with the code EDUP10OFF.
I'm thinking about a scenario where I will often hear in doing research, in particularly urban schools serving predominantly students of color, low income. Sometimes there's this belief by not all teachers, but some teachers and some administrators that parents don't care.
Yeah.
Why? I think how their interpretation of the interaction or the limited interaction there is.
Yep.
How would you respond to that? Or how would you help educators to change that perspective? That because I fundamentally believe that all parents do love and
Yes.
care for
Yeah.
their kids. They may not necessarily know how to show it in the way that is aligned with the values of the school itself.
That's right. No, I agree with you 1000%, Jacob. I believe that every caregiver and parent cares deeply about their young people, right? You can't tell me they don't care when these are the very folks who are working 40, 50, 60-hour shifts to make sure that their children have a roof over their head and clothes on their back and food on the table. These are the same parents who will show up at schools angry and upset if they feel like there has been some kind of injustice done to their children. So if they didn't care, they wouldn't show up the way that they show up. But I think you hit the nail on the head. I think sometimes we, school personnel, we have a sense of what care looks like, and it's very narrow. So that means that care means you bring your child to school in the morning, you drop them off, you pick them up at 3 o'clock, you make sure that their homework is done a certain way, you make sure that they behave a certain way. And part of what you have to recognize, a lot of folks don't fit into those boxes. And you have to understand that, look, the parents are doing the best they can do, given the circumstances that they're under. And so instead of sort of putting that label on parents and caregivers of not caring, why don't we see the assets of what they do, right? The fact they get their children to school. Some parents are unhoused, but they get their children to school. Some parents and caregivers are experiencing food insecurities, but they get their children to school. They're dealing with their own mental health challenge, but they get their children to school and try to best support them the way they know how. So I think we have to stop sort of looking at this as the glass half empty, but see the glass as half full and recognize that parents are doing the best they can. Not like they're sending the bad kids to us at school and keeping the good ones at home. They are sending us the best that they have, and it's up to us to try to see how we can build on that to help them be even better.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. So as you speak to educators and work with educational organizations, have you found there to be a prevailing question or challenge that is faced achieving educational equity? So if you had to distill it down, what would be the primary levers?
Wow, that's a great question because there's so many, but if I had to nail it down to one, let me go with this one. Mindsets and attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
And let me tell you what I mean by that. So mindsets and attitudes are vital in this work because, there's all kind of research on expectations that kids will live up or live down to the expectations that adults have for them. And there are a lot of beliefs and attitudes and values and biases that adults in the school building have toward kids for a variety of reasons. Those beliefs are oftentimes shaped by kids' socioeconomic status, by kids' first language, by kids' ability level, by their skin color, by their family composition. We form judgments about people all the time. And I think education is one domain where we have to be careful about those judgments that we form because we can be wrong. And our inaccuracy in sort of thinking about those families can do significant harm to them. Now, someone would say, well, how come you won't say something like, funding or inequality, school expenses, right? And I was going to say that, but here's the thing. I mean, we've had models in this country where we know funding streams have been unequal, but when you've got dedicated, caring educators, they still make a difference in those schools. It still happens today, right? We know we have schools that are severely under-resourced, but with the right kind of mindset and dedicated teachers who are, true to their craft, they still improve outcomes. So that's why I say in many ways, attitudes and beliefs are so vital. So I always ask school leaders, you got to look at this person who's across from you when you're doing an interview and ask this person, what do they think about poor children? What do they think about Black and brown children? What do you think about children who are living with their grandparents who are raising them? What do you fundamentally think about their abilities to learn? And don't give me this, oh, I believe all kids can learn or I love all kids. No, tell me what you're going to do when that child shows up and he's disengaged. Tell me how you're going to do when that child cusses you out because she feels like you didn't really respond to her the way she wanted to. Give me those kind of responses, because sometimes our kids show up and they are going to express their wants and needs in some very different ways than you might be accustomed to. And I maintain that the kid who cusses you out on Monday will bring you a snack on Tuesday, right? That's just the way some folks are. And I think you have to ask those folks across from you, or you have to ask yourself, would I be comfortable with this person teaching my son, my daughter, my grandson, my granddaughter, my niece or nephew? If they're not good enough for your children, they're not good enough for other people's children.
Right. Well, I think those mindsets are interesting because I was just in a conversation last week with some folks here in New York, just thinking about some state level issues. And one of the comments that came up is that there seems to be this pervasive and prevailing idea that new teachers are struggling with classroom management.
Mm-hmm.
And as you were speaking, it made me think about this notion of mindsets. So what is it how do we perceive students' actions?
Mm-hmm.
And then how do we value them in a way that we probably have not valued them before? So you talked about the student cussing you out. You know, I've been in that experience as a teacher, not necessarily cussing you out, but the student who gives you the hard time,
Yes.
but they show up every day.
That's right. That's right.
And they show up every day because they give you a hard time because they actually like you.
That part right there. That part right there. And I tell folks all the time, in all my years of being a classroom teacher, the students who were the most difficult for me, the most challenging, whenever I got them one-on-one, they were different children. Why? Because they were getting attention, right? Or the ones who I thought couldn't stand me at the start of the new year, they came running to my classroom, Mr. Howard, Mr. Howard. So yeah, they do like you, but I think that we have to, I always tell teachers this, first of all, you gotta have short memory, because you can't hold grudges against 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds, because that's just not what you do. You have to have a short memory. And you also have to recognize this: all behavior is functional. All behavior. So even what kids do when they're being quote unquote difficult, it serves a basic need of theirs that's not being met. Sometimes it's not about you. Sometimes I'm just angry because of the fact that we're living with my aunts and uncles and their 5 kids, and it's 4 of us, and I don't like living there. And so I'm just kind of just lashing out at you because you just happen to be the person who just kind of said something to me at the wrong time. I always ask educators to try to understand root causes of behaviors, because 9 times out of 10, it's not about you. It's about something else going on in that student's life. And I always tell educators this is why relationships are so foundational to teaching and learning, because when you have relationships, when you build trust, then you have the opportunity for care. And when young people know that you care about them, there is no limit to how much effort and time they will put into trying to be the best student for you they can possibly be.
Full circle. You talk about mindsets, relationships, care, and trust.
There you go.
And without the right mindsets, it's very difficult to achieve positive relationships, ultimately leading to care and trust.
That's right. That's right. Bingo.
So I want to pose some questions that have come from the field. So Dr. Ruth Best of Alliant International University, who happened to have been one of our guests prior, she asks, what are your thoughts on how we can successfully further the diversification of the teaching force within the current climate of censorship and silencing?
Oh man, that's a beautiful question. And that's one I struggle a lot with, because we're facing a significant crossroads. And that crossroads is anchored in the reality, the fact that educator diversity is on the decline. Right now, we've got about 82% of our teachers are white. Some estimates suggest that that number may be as high as 90% in the next decade. We have a dilemma on our hands. And so we have to think long and hard about what we have to do. First and foremost, we need to go on a major PR campaign to try to impress upon folks of color that teaching is a noble and important and transformative profession. I think we need to go to HBCs and Hispanic serving institutions and start to really recruit folks to think about teaching as a career field. I think we need to think about forgivable loan programs that we'll say we'll forgive loans if you do at least 5 years in this profession. I think we also need to tap into, here's what I say another overlooked body of folks are paraprofessionals. I go to schools all across this country, and paraprofessionals is where the diversity is, right? Paraprofessionals In some places are the Black and brown folks who live in the community, who speak the language, who know the families well. How do we start talking to those folks about pathways to teaching, right? Some of them already have credits that they've earned toward a degree or have some certifications, so we can tap into paraprofessionals as well. But the other part of this too, I think we put a lot of focus on the front end, on the recruitment side, Jacob, but we
Right.
need to also be as committed to the other side, which is the retention side, because we lose a lot of folks as well because we go through all these different tasks to get folks to do the work. And then Black teachers in particular, they feel so overwhelmed, they feel so burned out that 2, 3, 5 years in, they're gone. So we have to be equally as committed to the influx of folks into the profession and ask folks, how can we support them when they're in the profession so that we don't continue to lose the numbers that we lose? And then one final thing I would say, we have to do something about the standardized tests that have been a gatekeeper for lots of folks of color. I'm in California where we have so many of them, Praxis 1, Praxis 2. We have the California Subject Exam 1, California Subject Exam 2, the basic skills. And so the data tells us that there is not a huge correlation that exists between how well you do on these tests and how impactful of a teacher you are. But lots of folks of color I've seen who get stumped right there because they can't pass these qualifying exams. They get stumped right there because these tests have a cost involved with them, right? So if you don't pass the first time, you pay $350, you'll pay another $350. I know a woman who took the test 5 times and she never passed. She's like, I paid over $1,500 trying to pass this test. I'm just not doing it. So we got to think about what are the credentialing sort of entities that we should have for teaching. I'm not saying we shouldn't have any, because you want to have some type of standards, but we have to rethink the ones that we currently have, because I'm not convinced that all of them are necessarily built on what it means to be an effective teacher.
Right. I think you raise a very good point about the focus being largely on teacher recruitment.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think we pay enough teacher, particularly when we're talking about diversifying the field. How do we prepare folks to go into systems, particularly when the systems may not be aligned with, and we're talking about professionally, but everyone brings themselves to the profession.
Yes. Yes.
So how do you address norms that may not necessarily be culturally congruent, for example?
Yes. Yes.
How do we develop them to work with, and even for non-minority teachers, to work with students who may be different from whom you are? And even if you're a minority, the reality is
That's right.
we assume that because you are a person of color, that you can jive with easily other folks of color. But we're not monolithic. We all have our own different backgrounds and so on and so forth. And then this notion, again, once you develop them, how do we then, you're right, retain them?
That's right.
So I don't think we've given enough attention to the latter two. How do we prepare folks, and then how do we keep them in the profession?
Yeah, I would say on the front end, and I've said this before, and I work in teacher education here at UCLA, and I kind of frustrate some of my colleagues. I think we need to think about radically redesigning teacher preparation. And what I mean by that, I've talked about the standardized tests already. I would get rid of those things and try to find some new mechanisms. But the other thing we do, we have our pre-service teachers spend far too much time in university classrooms learning about theory and learning about methods. And let me be clear, theory and methods are important and they matter and they are a vital part of a teacher's development. But part of what I think we miss out on is we should be putting those pre-service teachers in K-12 classrooms day one. You need to be in it. You need to see how a teacher sets up her first day of the class, how she builds rapport that first week of the class. You need to be in schools to see how students show up, the students who are engaged and unengaged. I just am a firm advocate that many folks learn best when they are placed in the environment, because I've seen lots of folks who sit in university classrooms who are amazing in terms of citing Piaget stages of operational development and what Vygotsky says about sort of, cultural practices, can give you all the theories, right? But then go into a classroom with real life kids and struggle mightily, right? Because I think there's got to be this back and forth between seeing the theory, seeing the practice, where do they align, where do they misalign? But I think that, at the end of the day, you should be putting pre-service teachers in schools day one. They need to spend time in communities day one. Understand the ecosystem that students come from, because that's how you start to develop an appreciation for the cultural practices, the historical sort of factors that shape that community, the do's and don'ts in a particular cultural context, especially for folks who are not familiar with those particular communities. And I think you're spot on, Jacob. even Black and brown folks need to spend time in Black and brown communities because we're not all the same, to your point. And I've seen sometimes Black and brown folks be just as culturally incongruent with students as some white folks are. So this is for folks across the board to be immersed in this kind of teacher education, where we begin to understand not just content and not just pedagogy, but understand the cultural milieu that is the ecosystem in which young people live and learn and laugh every single day.
Yep. And again, I'm going to go back to this point you mentioned about mindsets. I remember when I was at a university in Pennsylvania, predominantly white student population, most with women, female students who were interested in teachers and becoming teachers. And so we were talking about placing them in, well, I'm just going to give it out, it's Johnstown. So Johnstown, downtown Johnstown. And so many of them did not want to go to that school district because they saw it as the urban district.
Yeah. Yeah.
However, we found once we placed them, and the quality of the placement was, I think, was well developed to help acculturate them within the milieu of the school, providing the right type of supports, the scaffolding. It was amazing to see them after they finished their first rotation early on, stating that they couldn't imagine teaching anywhere else.
Yep.
So, but there was a lot of resistance in the beginning because of what they perceived about the students in that community.
Yeah, mindsets matter. And we've seen that in so many different research domains that many folks, not all, but many folks, especially white women, go into teaching because they want to teach in the very communities where they grew up or communities like the ones that they grew up in. And many have a reticence to go into urban communities. But when it's all said and done, guess where the jobs are? Guess who's hiring? And I can tell you over the years, I've had folks who come to me and say, I never thought I would end up at this school or this community. So can you kind of give me a refresher on what you talked about last year or 3 years ago when you talked about cultural assets or cultural mapping? So yeah, we have to really kind of get at mindsets, because I've also known folks who said, I will not teach if it means I got to teach in that particular community. But on the flip side, I've had folks who said that, look, I did not want to teach in this community initially, but then after I kind of immersed myself, I became better for it, and I'm glad I chose it, to the point you just made.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. This episode of EDUP Xcelerated Excellence is supported in part by Eastern Connecticut State University. The path to your future begins at Eastern Connecticut State University. Explore a campus buzzing with creativity, innovation, and opportunity. From arts to sciences, we have programs that spark your curiosity and ignite your passion. Don't miss your chance to discover what makes Eastern unique. Visit us online to create your customized viewbook at easternct.edu/journey. That's easternct.edu/journey. We have another question from the field. This question is from Dr. Gaetan Jean-Marie. She is the Dean for the College of Education at Rowan University, and she asks, at your presidential ARA speech, you referenced organization routines drawing on Diamond and Gomez's work. So in P12 systems, what ways should they be disrupted using that perspective?
Yeah, so I really like the framework that John Diamond and Louis Gomez have around organizational routines, because they make the contention that organizational routines oftentimes are the very pillars that uphold tenets of white supremacy, and sometimes can be rooted in anti-Black racism. So let's take this to the P12 context per the question. So there are organizational routines, for example, that say that if Black kids are disruptive in schools, they need to be sent home. That's an organizational routine. We don't oftentimes try to understand the root causes. We don't try to understand why a student may have been disruptive in the first place. We just say our knee-jerk reaction is, you got to go, right? We have organizational routines, at least in the district that I work with, that oftentimes the most inexperienced teachers, brand new teachers, get the most difficult classrooms when they start. That's just an organizational routine, because the more seasoned teachers say, I don't want that class with those students. That's an organizational routine that produces inequality, right? We have organizational routines at a policy level that says, why do we fund, and look, I've seen this happen where you are. I saw a district in Delaware that funds one school, I think it was Red Clay, at one level, But then you go to Brandywine and they fund at a different level, right? And these kids take the same tests. They compete for the same jobs. They compete for the same careers. So how are we okay with just giving one group of students, say $15,000 per year per pupil, but another one $11,000 per year? That's a $4,000 a year difference. But the organizational routine says this is just what we do, right? So I always ask school leaders and even practitioners, think about the everyday things that we do, like the kid who's sitting in the class, who's always disruptive, who raises his hand, and because I, the teacher, don't like him, I just don't call on him. But I call on the quiet student over there who reminds me of me, and because she's going to give me the kind of right answer I think I want. So the organizational routine is I don't call on this kid because he's disruptive, she's compliant, and then I just call on that student consistently. Or, and I can go on and on with these, right? The organizational routine says that when Jacob gives me an answer, I'm sure to compliment him and say, Jacob, that's a really good answer that you just gave. I appreciate your effort. But when Malik gives us a good answer, I don't find any sort of compunction to reward or to give him words of affirmation. So I maintain we have these practices that are so ingrained that we don't even think about them sometimes, but they just constantly sort of just are reeking with inequality. So the question becomes, how do you know what the organizational routines are? And this is what I say to folks all the time. Ask students. They'll tell you what they are. The students have a sort of a keen insight and a powerful genius that says, let me tell you why this is problematic. I had a kid just tell me last week, my mom works a graveyard shift. She gets off at 8 o'clock. I can't get to school until 8:30. The bell rings at 8:15. They stop serving breakfast at 8:15, but the school will not allow kids to go get a breakfast and bring it into the classroom. He says, so I'm hungry in class every morning because my mother gets off work at a time when she gets to me, I miss breakfast. Why don't we change the policy, right? These are organizational routines that harm those who are most vulnerable, right? So I think that what we have to do is begin to ask young people where they see inequity being played out, where they feel like there's unfair practices, how they would redo schools. And you hear things like uniforms and discipline policies and the kind of things that they want in their curriculum. I just think it's us being willing, like I said earlier, to sit and hear and listen to the stinging indictments that some of our students would give us about what they want more of or less of in schools.
You know, the way when you were talking about those routines and the examples you gave, it sort of spoke to me as that's the unveiling of the true values of the classroom, the school, and the district. So if you insist on funding one district at a less rate, particularly when it has been historically marginalized or the community and historically under-resourced.
That's right.
It really does speak to the value that you have for that particular community.
Bingo. Spot on. And it happens all over the country, Jacob. You and I both can tell you about districts that do that, and people don't question it. We just say that's just the way it is.
So what advice would you give to practitioners and scholars who face struggles advocating for educational equity?
Yeah, find your community, find your people, because it's a hard, long road to do this by yourself. Teacher burnout is real. Teachers' sort of bandwidths are beyond being full. Find your people who will help to be in solidarity with you to fight for these issues that you care mostly about. I am deeply concerned about the fact that we're losing more people in this profession because I think folks survived COVID. And then I think you're seeing the post-mortem now from COVID. Folks are like, I'm just so spent from what happened over those last 2, 3, 4 years. And so I think for folks who are doing this work, I always try to tell them that, look, this is a marathon, not a sprint, even though we have a sense of urgency as we do it. And I always try to help folks to understand that you got to pick your battles. You got to find your allies, make sure that you're engaging in processes where you protect yourself as you do this work. But understand, always remember what your why is. And the minute you get to a point where you feel like your why is no longer your why, then ask yourself the question, is this what you should still be doing? I see too many educators who have checked out, too many educators who are just apathetic in what they do. And don't get me wrong. I understand that folks need their jobs, they need their paychecks, they need their benefits. I get all that. But I just ask folks to think about the harm that you are doing and the harm that you can do if you have just checked out and you're not giving students what they deserve. And so if you find yourself in that position, you have to ask yourself, do I need to be contemplating a career path change? And you can still be in education. You just may not be with other people's children on a day in, day out basis. So that's what I would offer those folks.
Right. That's so true. And, it's so interesting because I think we know that change is inevitable. And you just mentioned COVID. So this sort of post-COVID shift, going into COVID or during COVID, we had uprise in an attention to racial equity,
Mm-hmm.
Black Lives Matters, and some
Yep.
other issues. But now that COVID is tempered off, we're seeing a backlash.
That's right. That's
So,
right.
you saw organizations starting to put more people of color in their ads and advertisements, and stores having Black-owned shelves and indicating, oh, Black-owned,
Yep.
products, and so on and so forth. And now we're seeing this move back towards, like, I think the question earlier is around censorship.
That's right.
So,
DEI, anti-DEI, these
yeah,
book bans. So yeah. So
yeah,
it's just I find it fascinating. And I get this is a wake-up moment for those of us like you and I, Jacob, who are advocates of equity and diversity, because I think the backlash is that folks will say now, we don't want books that look like you. We don't want to tell the real history of this country. We don't want to hear the word diversity. We don't want to hear the word inclusion. And in some states, I saw something recently about Tennessee that you can be fired if they feel like you teach about race in ways that are not in alignment with their framework. So we have to think about what kind of society are we living in where we're basically engaging in erasure. We don't want your story to be told. We call you anti-American if you begin to question some of the ways of how America has treated some of its citizens. So yeah, I think we just have to be willing to kind of protect ourselves as we engage in these battles, because we are in a very curious political moment. And I think to every action, there's a reaction. I think you make an excellent point. The action that happened post George Floyd's death was that there was this rush to embrace Blackness. And I think the reaction now is folks said, oh, no, 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 we won't. We're going to roll back all that stuff. We find that now a lot of those companies who pledged billions of dollars never delivered on those promises to pay those billions of dollars. So I think the political moment, really shaped by a former president, has really made it okay and emboldened people to be just flat out racist, hateful, and discriminatory to people who look like you and I.
and it goes back to the idea of relationships.
Yep.
So we have to be steadfast in this work on equity, because imagine the type of negative relationships that could be created within
That's
this
right.
country.
That's right. Bingo. Bingo.
So I want to ask, as we begin to close out, what can listeners look forward to from you, Dr. Tyrone Howard, and how might they engage with you beyond this podcast?
Sure. So you can find me on my socials on X at Tyrone C. Howard, on Instagram at Dr._Tyrone Howard. You can Google me for my email on my UCLA website. That's always a way that I respond to folks. What's next? Who knows? I'm always putting my hands into something, but I'm going to continue to promote this book and try to lift up these principles of justice, belonging, and repair, because that's really where my work is centered now. And looking at that across different organizations. And I'm a part of the fight that is trying to, counteract this backlash that we just talked about, right? So I'm working with different school districts, different social service agencies, different nonprofits, different elected officials. At this point in time, you have to find organizations, you have to find people who are willing to be part of an agenda that you feel matches with your values. And so that's what I continue to do. I'm always in schools trying to find ways to listen to students and learn from students. That's kind of where, for me, I find my real joy. That's what gives me hope, is listening to young people, because I think their brilliance is oftentimes just so misunderstood. So yeah, that's what I do. So when I come to cities, I'm always saying, okay, how can we get to a school? How can we talk to some students?
So we know you're absolutely busy right now because your book is on fire. So Equity Now, Justice, Repair, and Belonging in Schools. So I think if you haven't gotten a copy, you should get a copy today. And you can Google those and then find it on different outlets. Dr. Tyrone Howard, thank you so much for allowing us this time to learn with and from you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for engaging with the EDUP Accelerated Excellence community. You can find this episode and others on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and Apple Music. And if you like this episode, please don't forget to follow us and share within your network.